So there's this massive economic standoff brewing between the European Union and the United States. And honestly, it looks like the EU is getting ready to deploy a powerful, never-before-used weapon. It's a really high-stakes dilemma, and it has consequences for, well, everyone. So let's get right into it and break down what's really going on here. Okay, so at the very heart of all this is a tool so powerful they're calling it the Trade Bazooka. Seriously, its official name is the Anti-Coercion Instrument, or ACI, and it basically gives the EU the power to retaliate against economic pressure with absolutely overwhelming force. Now you might be asking, why would Europe even think about using something like that? Well, to get it, we actually have to look at a pretty recent case study that provides a stunningly effective playbook. Right? And that playbook, it comes from looking at a potential, kind of wild trade war scenario from 2025. What happened in that case study gives us a crucial blueprint for what could happen right now between the EU and the US. Okay, so in this scenario, things went from 0 to 100, like incredibly fast. On April 2nd, the US announces tariffs. China doesn't even blink, they retaliate the very next day. This just kicks off this insane cycle of back and forth that, in just a few weeks, leads to a staggering 125% tariff on both sides. But then, and this is the crazy part, the whole thing just imploded, almost overnight. By May 12th, a deal is done, and it wipes out almost all of those new tariffs. So what on earth happened? Okay, get this, because it's totally counterintuitive. Everyone thought China's retaliatory tariffs were what was hurting the American economy, but the real pain? It was self-inflicted. I mean, it turns out that US manufacturing is just so dependent on Chinese parts and components that the American tariffs were basically making it impossible for their own factories to operate. And look, this wasn't just some abstract theory. The pain was real, and it was immediate. By early May, US factories were already slowing down, layoffs were starting to pile up. And this quote from the Wall Street Journal really shows you the kind of pressure that was building on the administration. You had iconic American industries like the car makers getting absolutely hammered by their own government's policy. And this is where it gets really interesting. The US was in a position where it desperately needed to lower its own tariffs, but it couldn't just do it, because politically, that would have looked like a total surrender. This is what analyst Richard Baldwin calls a narrative trap. It's like he built this giant tariff wall, only to find out it was trapping his own supporters inside. And the irony is, he actually needed China to act first so he could spin his own climb down as some kind of victory. So, to really get why things blew up like they did, we need to step back from the numbers and look at the psychology behind it all. Analyst Richard Baldwin has this theory he calls the grievance doctrine. And the idea is actually pretty simple, but it is so powerful. It says that trade policy isn't about spreadsheets and economic models. It's about emotion. It's about this deeply held belief that the US has been the victim of an unfair global system for decades, and that tariffs are basically a way of getting even. And you might think, okay, that's just some analyst theory, but no. The administration's own policy documents basically said the same thing. They framed trade as this matter of national victimization, and this was all about settling a score for what they saw as past injustices. So once you see it through this grievance lens, the crazy fast escalation suddenly makes a whole lot more sense. When China retaliated, it wasn't just seen as a normal economic move. No, in this logic, it was seen as foreigners daring to fight back, which just deepened this sense of American victimization. As Baldwin put it, the language being used sounded less like a trade debate and more like they were talking about war crime. All right, so that's the playbook China used. It worked because US factories literally couldn't run without Chinese parts. The big question now, of course, is, can Europe pull off the same move? Do they even have that kind of leverage? Well, when you look at the numbers, the answer is a huge, resounding yes. China might be number one when it comes to supplying industrial parts to the US, but guess who's right there at number two? The European Union. It's super close. This gives the EU this immense and honestly often underestimated supply chain power over the US economy. And we're not just talking about random stuff. This leverage is concentrated in really critical areas. American factories depend heavily on European precision machinery and specialized parts. But the one that really jumps out is chemicals. I mean, the EU supplies over a third of all US chemical imports. You just can't find that stuff somewhere else overnight. Okay, so we've established Europe has the economic muscle. They've got the leverage. So what about the weapon itself? Let's take a closer look at this so-called trade bazooka, the Anti-Coercion Instrument, the ACI. So, this thing, the ACI, was officially put on the books in late 2023. And really, it's designed to be a deterrent, a don't even think about it kind of tool. It basically gives the EU a legal way to fight back if another country tries to use economic pressure to bully them or any of the member states into doing something they don't want to do.
Now, it's super important to understand that firing this bazooka is not some knee-jerk reaction. It's actually a highly structured process with a lot of checks and balances. First, the Commission has to investigate. Then, the Council, which represents all the member states, has to vote and agree that, yes, coercion is happening. And this is key. They have to try diplomacy first. That's a required step. Only if that fails can the EU actually deploy its countermeasures.
But if diplomacy fails and they do pull the trigger, whoa, the options are massive. We are talking way beyond simple tariffs here. The ACI lets the EU do things like block companies from its huge public contracts, restrict access to European financial markets, and even mess with intellectual property rights. The list of options is just enormous. So, let's recap. The EU has the economic leverage, and it has the weapon. And that brings us right to the heart of the matter, this incredibly tough spot European leaders are in right now.
You see, on one side, there's a pretty clear path to what looks like an economic win. They could follow China's playbook, retaliate, trigger this unsustainable escalation from the US, and then use the pain that causes in the US manufacturing sector to force a climb down. But on the other hand here is absolutely enormous. This could easily spiral beyond a simple trade spot and threaten the entire transatlantic security alliance, and that's the kind of risk that, definitely keeps world leaders up at night.
And you can just feel the frustration from the public bubbling up. A lot of people are just tired of all the talk and they want to see some action. This sentiment really captures that feeling that, endless planning in the face of aggression just starts to look like weakness. And that really gets to the core of the argument for using this thing. The belief is that if you don't stand up to economic bullying now, you're just inviting more of it later. For a lot of people, this is a line in the sand moment for the EU, a time to show that it can't be pushed around. But then, of course, there's the other side of the coin, a really powerful counterargument. Others are terrified that in this specific relationship with the US, the ACI isn't a targeted weapon at all. It's more like a grenade that you drop at your own feet. The fear is that using it against a crucial security partner like the US could just set off a chain reaction that nobody can control, doing damage that you just can't undo. And so that's where we are. It all comes down to this one huge question. The EU has a loaded bazooka, it has a playbook that says firing it could actually work, could lead to an economic win, but the potential collateral damage to its most important security relationship is immense. So, should the EU pull the trigger? That, right there, is the multi-trillion-dollar question.